Losing your spouse while raising young children is every parent's nightmare. But imagine being thrown out of your home with your babies just weeks after burying your husband, not by strangers, but by the billionaire family you devoted your life to serving. That's exactly what happened to Sandra Burke. The Langfords had employed her for years, watching her scrub their marble floors until they gleamed. Yet when tragedy struck, Margaret Langford looked her in the eye and said coldly, "My estate accommodations are for employees, not widows." Sandra had nowhere to go except a crumbling Victorian house on the edge of town that her late father once owned. What Sandra didn't know was that hidden within her father's quiet life as a janitor was a secret that would change everything. But would it heal the wounds of humiliation, or would it force her to choose between justice and grace? Before we continue, drop a comment telling us where you're watching from. And if Sandra's story moves you, hit that subscribe button, because tomorrow's story will blow your mind. Now let's dive in. Sandra Burke stood on the sagging front porch of the house on Ashbury Road, her two young children clinging to her dress as the sunset painted the sky in shades of amber and gold. In her hand, she clutched a small photograph of her late husband, Thomas, his chauffeur's cap tilted at that familiar angle, his smile frozen in happier times. The house behind her groaned under the weight of decades, its white paint peeling in long, defeated strips, windows clouded with grime, the roof dotted with rust and missing shingles. This was her father's house. The house Harold Burke had bought with his janitor's wages and called home until the day he died. Now it was Sandra's only refuge, a shelter built on memories and desperation. Sandra had met Thomas Burke 6 years ago when she first stepped through the wrought iron gates of the Langford estate. She'd been 23 years old, fresh out of community college with a certificate in hospitality management and dreams of running her own cleaning business someday. The estate job was supposed to be temporary, just long enough to save money and build her resume. The Langford mansion sprawled across 12 acres of manicured lawns and imported gardens, its white marble facade gleaming like a monument to wealth. Inside, the hallways stretched endlessly, lined with oil paintings of ancestors whose stern faces seemed to judge anyone who dared walk beneath them. Crystal chandeliers hung from 20-foot ceilings, casting prismatic light across floors so polished Sandra could see her reflection in them. Margaret Langford had interviewed her in the East Parlor, a room larger than Sandra's entire childhood home. Margaret sat perched on an ivory settee, her silver hair styled into an elegant chignon, her pearls catching the afternoon light. She'd looked Sandra up and down with the same critical eye one might use to inspect furniture. "You come with recommendations," Margaret had said, her tone suggesting this was barely adequate. "My previous housekeeper retired after 30 years. I expect the same level of dedication, discretion, and invisibility. The Langfords value our privacy." Sandra had nodded, understanding immediately what invisibility meant. She was to be a ghost in their home, present enough to clean, absent enough to forget. Thomas had been different from the start. She'd first noticed him in the garage, polishing one of the family's 3 Mercedes-Benzes until the black paint looked liquid. He was tall, with warm brown eyes and a smile that made the corners crinkle. When he saw her struggling with a bucket of cleaning supplies, he jogged over without hesitation. "Let me help you with that," he'd said, taking the heavy bucket from her hands. "You must be the new housekeeper. I'm Thomas. I drive for the family." His kindness had been like oxygen in a suffocating place. While Margaret Langford criticized the way Sandra folded towels and Richard Langford walked past her as if she didn't exist, Thomas noticed her. He'd leave her notes of encouragement tucked into the cleaning supply closet. "You're doing great. Don't let them get to you." He'd save her a seat at the staff dinner table and make her laugh with impressions of Margaret's clipped, imperious voice. Their courtship had been quiet and precious. Stolen moments in the garden after their shifts, walks along the estate's tree-lined paths, conversations that stretched late into the night. Thomas had dreams too. He wanted to open an automotive repair shop, to work with his hands on engines instead of opening car doors for people who never said thank you. When he proposed to her in the servants' quarters, a simple gold band because it was all he could afford, Sandra had cried tears of pure joy. They married at the courthouse with Sandra's father and 2 staff members as witnesses. The Langfords hadn't attended, nor had they been invited. Margaret's disapproval had been immediate and icy. Fraternization between staff creates complications, she'd said. See that your personal affairs don't interfere with your duties. But Sandra and Thomas had been happy, despite her coldness. They'd moved into the slightly larger servants' quarters behind the main house, a converted carriage house with 2 rooms and a view of the estate's rose gardens. When Sandra became pregnant, Thomas had painted the nursery himself, humming old gospel songs his mother used to sing. When the ultrasound revealed twins, a boy and a girl, they'd held each other and wept with joy and terror. The Langfords had barely acknowledged the baby's births. No gifts, no congratulations, just Margaret's terse comment, "I trust your maternity leave will be brief." Sandra had returned to work 2 weeks later, her body still healing, her heart torn between the nursery and the marble floors that demanded her attention. Thomas had stepped up, adjusting his driving schedule to watch the children when she worked. They'd made it work through sheer determination and love, but their fragile happiness had shattered on a rainy Tuesday in October. Thomas had been driving Charles Langford, Margaret's son and the family's chief financial officer, to a business meeting across town. Charles had been on his phone, barking orders about a real estate deal, when he'd suddenly shouted for Thomas to take a different route to avoid traffic. Thomas had swerved to comply, the wet roads turning treacherous. The truck had come out of nowhere, running a red light at full speed. The impact was instantaneous. Charles walked away with minor injuries. Thomas died before the ambulance arrived. Sandra remembered standing in the hospital corridor, her children with a neighbor, her world dissolving around her. She'd expected Margaret to come, to say something, anything, that acknowledged Thomas's sacrifice, his loyalty, his life. Instead, Margaret had arrived flanked by the family attorney. She'd stood in the hallway, her expression carefully neutral, and said, "The family will cover funeral expenses. It's the least we can do after his years of service." Service. As if Thomas had been a tool that broke during use. The funeral had been small. Sandra's father had come, his own janitorial uniform traded for an old suit that smelled of mothballs. A few staff members attended, their faces drawn with shared grief and fear. This could have been any of us. The Langfords sent flowers but didn't attend. 3 days after they buried Thomas, Margaret had summoned Sandra to the main house library. Sandra had walked those marble halls feeling like a stranger, her reflection in the floors now ghostly and unfamiliar. Margaret had been standing by the window, backlit by autumn sunlight, her silhouette sharp and unforgiving. "Sandra, you have my condolences," Margaret had begun, her voice carrying no warmth. "Thomas was a reliable employee. However, we must discuss your living situation." She turned then, her pale blue eyes devoid of empathy. "The servants' quarters are reserved for active staff members. You may stay until the week's end. After that, I'll need you to vacate the premises." The words had struck Sandra like physical blows. "Mrs. Langford, I still work here. I'm still your housekeeper." "Were," Margaret corrected. "Your position required the flexibility to work irregular hours. With 2 small children and no spouse, that's no longer feasible. I'm sure you understand." Sandra had understood perfectly. She understood that her value had been tied entirely to her usefulness, that her grief was an inconvenience, that her children were liabilities. She'd stood there, trembling with shock and rage, searching for words that wouldn't come. "My staff accommodations are for employees, not widows," Margaret had added, as if clarifying a simple business transaction. "You have until Sunday." Sandra had walked back to the carriage house in a daze. She'd packed their few belongings into garbage bags and cardboard boxes, her movements mechanical. Her babies had watched her with wide, confused eyes, sensing the wrongness but unable to comprehend it. She'd remembered then, in the midst of her packing, the last words Thomas had said to her before leaving for that final drive. He'd kissed her forehead, his lips warm and familiar, and whispered, "Take care of them. Don't let this world break you." On Sunday morning, Sandra had loaded everything they owned into her father's old pickup truck. She'd stood one last time in front of the grand estate, her children holding her hands, the morning sun cold and indifferent. No one came to say goodbye. No one watched from the windows. She'd walk through those wrought iron gates for the final time, unseen, unthanked, and already forgotten by the family she'd served for 6 years. In her pocket was the address to her father's abandoned house on Ashbury Road and $47 in cash. The Langford estate disappeared behind her in the rearview mirror, its marble facade glinting in the sun like polished bone. Sandra didn't look back. She couldn't afford to. Her children needed her to be strong, even when strength felt impossible. What she didn't know, what she couldn't possibly have known as she drove away, was that her father's quiet life had held a secret that would change everything. But that discovery still lay months ahead, buried beneath grief and survival, and the daily battle to keep her children fed. For now, all she had was a decaying house, her father's memory, and Thomas's final plea echoing in her heart. Don't let this world break you. The house on Ashbury Road looked even worse in daylight. Sandra stood in the overgrown front yard, her children pressed against her legs, staring at what would now be their home. The Victorian structure sagged under its own weight, as if exhausted from decades of neglect. Paint peeled from the wooden siding in long, defeated strips, revealing gray, weathered boards beneath. Several windows were broken, their jagged edges catching the afternoon sun like broken teeth. The front porch listed dangerously to one side, its ornate railings rotted through in places. This was her inheritance, not the kind the Langfords would recognize, but the only one Harold Burke had been able to leave his daughter. "Mama, is this our new house?" her daughter Lily asked, her small voice uncertain. Sandra forced a smile she didn't feel. "Yes, baby, it needs some work, but it's ours." Her son, Marcus, was braver, already pulling away to investigate. "Can we go inside?" The front door groaned on rusted hinges when Sandra pushed it open, and the smell hit her immediately. Mildew, dust, and the particular staleness of a place where air hasn't circulated in years. She stepped carefully across the threshold, testing each floorboard before putting her full weight on it. Some creaked ominously, others felt soft with rot. The interior was a time capsule of her father's life, frozen in the moment he'd left for the Langfords' guest house, where he'd spent his final years. Dust blanketed every surface like gray snow. Cobwebs draped the corners in elaborate, ghostly tapestries. The furniture, what little remained, sat beneath faded sheets that had long ago surrendered to grime. But beneath the decay, Sandra could see traces of the home her father had built. The crown molding, though cracked, was intricate and beautiful. The fireplace mantel was carved oak, solid and enduring. The hardwood floors, warped though they were, had once gleamed. "He tried," Sandra whispered to herself. "He really tried." Over the next 3 days, Sandra cleaned with the same dedication she'd once given the Langford estate. The difference was that this time, every surface she scrubbed belonged to her children. Every corner she cleared was theirs to grow up in. Her hands blistered and bled, but she didn't stop. She couldn't afford to stop. Not when stopping meant thinking about Thomas, about Margaret Langford's cold dismissal, about how far she'd fallen. On the fourth evening, while scrubbing what would become the children's bedroom, Sandra found her father's old briefcase wedged behind a loose baseboard. The leather was cracked and faded, the brass clasps tarnished green. Inside, she discovered a collection of items that felt like archaeological artifacts from a life she'd only partially known. There were faded ledgers filled with her father's precise handwriting, columns of numbers, dates, company names she didn't recognize. Stock certificates printed on heavy paper, their edges yellowed with age. Clean Tech Industries, Riverside Properties, Northern Manufacturing. She'd never heard her father mention any of these. Beneath the certificates were letters, dozens of them, from something called the Northside Investment Club. The letterhead was simple, the paper ordinary, but the content made Sandra pause. "Dear Mr. Burke, thank you for your continued participation in our monthly investment group. Your contribution of $50 has been allocated according to your specifications, 60% to dividend growth stocks, 40% to emerging small-cap companies." Sandra set the letter down, confusion mixing with something that felt dangerously close to hope. Her father had been investing? The man who'd worn the same 3 shirts in rotation, who'd eaten canned soup for dinner to save money, who'd told her education was the only real wealth? She rifled through more papers, account statements from the 1990s, handwritten notes about compound interest and long-term holdings, newspaper clippings about companies she'd never heard of. It all seemed like the daydreams of a man who'd never had enough, who'd spent his life scrubbing floors and imagining what financial security might look like. Sandra closed the briefcase and pushed it aside. She had more immediate concerns. The roof leaked in 3 places, the water heater didn't work, and her savings had dwindled to less than $200. The next morning, Sandra began her new routine. She dropped the children at a church daycare that charged on a sliding scale, then worked whatever jobs she could find. She cleaned office buildings at night, her keyring jangling with access to a dozen anonymous corporate spaces. She scrubbed floors at a laundromat during the day, the smell of detergent becoming permanently embedded in her clothes. On weekends, she babysat for neighbors who paid in cash and casseroles. Her hands, once soft despite her work at the Langfords, became rough and permanently red. Her back ached constantly. She fell into bed each night, too exhausted to dream, only to wake before dawn to start again. But her children's laughter kept her going. Marcus and Lily adapted to their new life with the resilience of the young. They played in the overgrown backyard, turning fallen branches into magic wands and abandoned tires into castles. They didn't seem to notice that their clothes came from donation bins or that dinner was often rice and beans 3 nights running. One evening, about 6 weeks after they'd moved in, Sandra came home from a double shift to find Marcus sitting cross-legged on the living room floor, surrounded by papers from Harold's briefcase. She'd forgotten about it, too consumed with survival to think about her father's old documents. "Mama, what's this?" Marcus asked, holding up one of the letters. "Just some old papers of your grandfather's," Sandra said, setting down her purse with a sigh. "Put them back, honey." But Marcus was already reading, his 6-year-old voice stumbling over the bigger words. "Dear Mr. Burke, thank you for your patience in holding your positions through market volatility." He looked up at her, confused. "What does this mean?" Sandra took the letter, her eyes scanning the words she'd dismissed weeks ago. This one was more recent, dated just 3 years before her father's death. At the bottom, in her father's familiar handwriting, was a note to himself: "If patience is wealth, then I am rich already." The words hit Sandra like a physical blow. She sank onto the couch, reading the sentence again and again. It sounded like her father, always philosophical, always finding meaning in struggle. But there was something in those words that haunted her, something that suggested he'd known something she didn't. "Mama?" Lily appeared in the doorway, rubbing sleep from her eyes. "Are you sad?" Sandra pulled both children close, the letter still clutched in her hand. "No, baby, I'm just remembering." That night, after the children fell asleep, Sandra couldn't stop thinking about her father's words. "If patience is wealth, then I am rich already." What had he meant? Was it just another one of his philosophical musings? Or had he actually believed he'd accumulated something of value in those investment clubs and stock certificates? She wanted to investigate further, to make sense of the cryptic documents, but exhaustion pulled at her like an undertow. She had another shift in 6 hours. The next morning, Sandra woke to her phone buzzing on the nightstand. An unknown number. She let it go to voicemail, probably a creditor or a wrong number. She'd learned not to answer calls from numbers she didn't recognize. The phone rang again 20 minutes later while she was making the children breakfast. Same number. Sandra ignored it, focusing instead on stretching their last eggs into scrambled portions that looked bigger than they were. Throughout the day, the calls continued. Once while she was mopping at the laundromat, twice during her break. Again as she picked up the children from daycare. Each time, Sandra let it ring. She was used to persistent creditors, to scammers trying to take advantage of the desperate. She had neither the time nor the energy to deal with whatever they wanted. By evening, there had been 7 calls from the same number. No voicemail, just the persistent ringing that felt almost accusatory. Sandra stared at her phone as it rang for the 8th time, her thumb hovering over the answer button. But then Marcus called for help with his homework, and Lily needed a bath, and by the time she looked at her phone again, it had stopped ringing. She set it on the kitchen counter face down and tried to ignore the uneasy feeling in her stomach. The phone remained silent for the rest of the evening, but Sandra couldn't shake the sense that something was shifting. that her father's cryptic words and those persistent calls were somehow connected. She retrieved the briefcase from where she'd stashed it in the closet and spread the documents across the kitchen table after the children went to bed. Stock certificates, investment club letters, account statements, all of it from years ago, all of it seemingly worthless. But her father's note stared up at her from that letter. If patience is wealth, then I am rich already. What if he hadn't been speaking metaphorically? What if he'd actually known something, accumulated something, that she'd dismissed as fantasy? Sandra's hands trembled as she sorted through the papers, looking for anything current, anything that might explain why a stranger was calling her repeatedly. She found nothing, just old documents, faded dreams, and a dead man's optimism. Exhausted and frustrated, Sandra gathered the papers and shoved them back into the briefcase. She had work in the morning, a cleaning job at a medical office that paid $10 an hour if she didn't ask questions. That was her reality, not stock certificates from the 1990s or mysterious phone calls. As she finally collapsed into bed, her father's words echoed in her mind one more time. If patience is wealth, then I am rich already. Tomorrow, she decided, if the number called again, she would answer. Not because she believed that anything would come of it, but because she needed to put this nagging feeling to rest. She needed to prove to herself that her father's dreams had been just that, dreams, so she could focus on the brutal, necessary work of survival. The phone sat silent on her nightstand, its dark screen reflecting nothing back. But in the morning it would ring again, and this time everything would change. 3 weeks passed in a blur of scrubbing and survival. Sandra's routine became mechanical. Wake before dawn, dress the children, drop them at daycare, work, pick them up, feed them whatever she could stretch from her dwindling grocery budget, collapse into bed, repeat. The unknown number called every few days, always at odd hours, during her lunch break, while she was bathing the children, once at 11 at night when she'd finally sat down with a cup of weak tea. Each time, Sandra let it ring. She'd learned that answering unknown numbers only brought bad news. Collection agencies, scammers promising debt relief for a fee, automated voices threatening legal action over unpaid bills. But this caller was persistent in a way that felt different. No voicemails, no text messages, just the same number appearing on her screen with clockwork regularity. On a Thursday evening, 3 weeks after the calls began, Sandra stood at the kitchen sink washing dishes by hand. The dishwasher had broken years before her father's death, and she had neither the money nor the energy to fix it. Her hands moved automatically, scrubbing at dried macaroni while her mind wandered to the medical office cleaning job she'd start in 2 hours. The night shifts paid slightly better, but they meant less sleep, more exhaustion, and the constant worry that she was failing her children by being absent. Her phone buzzed on the counter, the same unknown number. Something in Sandra snapped. The accumulated weight of Thomas's death, Margaret Langford's cruelty, the relentless grind of poverty, it all crystallized into a white-hot flash of anger. She dried her hands roughly on a dish towel and snatched up the phone. "What?" she answered, her voice sharp. "What do you want?" There was a pause, and then a man's voice, calm, warm, and completely unbothered by her hostility. "Ms. Burke? Sandra Burke? Who's asking?" Sandra's grip tightened on the phone. "And how did you get this number?" "My name is James Ellis. I'm a financial attorney with Whitmore and Associates in New York. I've been trying to reach you regarding your late father's estate." Sandra laughed, a bitter, brittle sound that surprised even her. "My father's estate? Sir, I don't know what kind of scam this is, but I don't have time for it. My father died with nothing but an old house and a briefcase full of worthless stock certificates. So whatever you're selling, Ms. Burke, please." Mr. Ellis's voice remained patient. "I understand your skepticism, but I assure you this isn't a scam. I represent the legal interests of several shareholders in clean tech industries, including your father, Harold Burke. Are you familiar with that company?" Sandra's laughter died. Clean tech industries. She'd seen that name on the certificates in her father's briefcase, in those investment club letters she'd dismissed as fantasy. I, I've seen the name," she admitted slowly, "but those certificates are from the 90s. That company probably doesn't even exist anymore. On the contrary, Ms. Burke, Clean Tech Industries went public 8 months ago, and the company manufactures eco-friendly janitorial supplies and equipment, everything from industrial floor cleaners to sustainable cleaning solutions for commercial buildings. They've become one of the fastest growing companies in the sector. Sandra sank into one of the kitchen chairs, her legs suddenly unsteady. I don't understand. What does this have to do with my father? Your father was an original investor and partial owner. He purchased shares in Clean Tech when it was just a small startup in 1989. But after 1989, a local operation run by three former janitors who wanted to create better, safer cleaning products. Over the decades, your father continued to invest, slowly accumulating shares. When the company went public, those shares became quite valuable. The kitchen felt too small suddenly, the walls pressing in. Sandra's voice came out as a whisper. How valuable? Ms. Burke, I think this conversation would be better suited for an in-person meeting. There are legal documents to review, paperwork to sign, decisions to be made. Could you come to our office? Or I could travel to you. Just tell me. Sandra's hand trembled as she pressed the phone harder against her ear. Please, how much are we talking about? Mr. Ellis was quiet for a long moment. When he spoke, his voice was gentle, as if he understood the words he was about to say would shatter her world and rebuild it in the same breath. Ms. Burke, your father's holdings in Clean Tech Industries, combined with his other long-term investments and dividend accumulations, total approximately $150 million. You are the sole heir to his estate. The phone slipped from Sandra's hand and clattered onto the kitchen table. $150 million. The words didn't make sense, couldn't make sense. She stared at the scratched formica table, at her work-roughened hands, at the water stains on the ceiling she hadn't been able to fix. $150 million. She picked up the phone with shaking fingers. That's not possible. My father was a janitor. He worked his whole life and barely had enough to... Your father was incredibly patient and strategic, Mr. Ellis interrupted gently. He invested small amounts consistently over 40 years. He lived frugally, reinvested his dividends, and held his positions through market volatility. What he built wasn't just wealth, Ms. Burke. It was a legacy. And he wanted you to have it. Tears streamed down Sandra's face, hot and sudden. She thought of her father in his worn work uniform, smelling of cleaning chemicals and determination. She thought of the way he'd always told her education was the key to breaking generational poverty, how he'd scraped together every penny for her community college tuition. She thought of how he'd died in a guest house on someone else's property because he couldn't afford his own health care. He never told me, she whispered. Why didn't he tell me? I believe he wanted you to discover it when you needed it most, Mrs. Ellis said softly. He left specific instructions with our firm. We were to contact you only after his death and only after a reasonable period of time. He wrote in his will, let Sandra stand on her own first. Let her know her own strength. Then show her what I built beneath her feet. Sandra couldn't breathe. Her chest felt tight, her vision blurred with tears. Her children were asleep in the next room, in a house held together by determination and duct tape. She'd worked 3 jobs, scrubbed floors until her hands bled, absorbed the Langfords' contempt like it was deserved. And all this time, her father had left her enough money to never struggle again. Ms. Burke, are you still there? Yes, Sandra managed. I'm here. Your father wanted you to know what hard work built, Mr. Ellis said. Not just his work, yours too. The strength you've shown, the resilience, the refusal to break even when the world tried its hardest. That's the real inheritance, Ms. Burke. The money is just confirmation. After they had arranged a meeting for the following week, Mr. Ellis would fly out to meet her, he insisted, given the circumstances. Sandra sat alone in the kitchen for a long time. The night shift at the medical office came and went. She called in sick for the first time in her life. She walked to the living room where her father's briefcase still sat, half forgotten in the corner. She'd shoved it aside after Marcus had read that letter, too focused on survival to care about old papers and expired dreams. But they hadn't been expired. They'd been patient. Sandra opened the briefcase with trembling hands and sorted through the papers until she found what she was looking for. The ledgers. She flipped through pages of her father's meticulous handwriting, tracking investments month by month, year by year. Small amounts, $50 here, 100 there. Nothing dramatic, nothing that would have changed their daily struggle, but consistent, relentless, patient. At the back of one ledger, tucked into a sleeve she'd missed before, was a sealed envelope. The paper was cream-colored, expensive feeling. On the front, in her father's familiar script, "For Sandra, when the world forgets your worth." Sandra's hands shook so badly she could barely open it. She slid her finger under the flap, breaking the seal, and pulled out a single sheet of paper. The letter was dated 3 months before her father died. "My dearest Sandra, if you're reading this, then Mr. Ellis has found you, and you know what I've left behind. I imagine you're confused, perhaps angry that I never told you. But I need you to understand something. I didn't hide this from you out of cruelty or mistrust. I hid it because I knew that if you'd known about this money, you might have stopped fighting. You might have waited for rescue instead of building your own strength. I've watched you your whole life, baby girl. You have a light in you that no amount of poverty could dim. You work hard not because you have to, but because you understand that dignity comes from knowing your own worth, not from what others think of you. I was a janitor. So were you. The world looked at us and saw people who cleaned up other people's messes, who scrubbed floors, who were invisible. But we were never invisible. We saw everything. We learned everything, and we built something those people could never understand. Patience and perseverance. The money I'm leaving you isn't charity, Sandra. You earned every penny through the strength you showed, the character you developed, and the refusal to let this world break you. When people treated you as less than, you held your head high. When life knocked you down, you got back up. This money is proof that even those who clean the floors of the mighty can one day own the ground they walk on. Use it wisely, use it kindly, and never forget, your worth was never in the dirt you cleaned, but in the hands that worked and the heart that refused to quit. I love you, baby girl. I'm so proud of you. Forever your father, Harold Burke, P.S. If patience is wealth, then I am rich already, and so are you. Sandra read the letter 3 times, tears streaming down her face, her father's words searing themselves into her heart. She thought about Margaret Langford's cold dismissal, about scrubbing floors for pennies while billionaires walked over her as if she didn't exist. She thought about Thomas's death, about the servants' quarters she'd been kicked out of, about this broken house that had become her only refuge. The woman the Langfords had thrown away like trash was worth more than their entire estate. Sandra folded the letter carefully and held it against her chest. In the next room, she could hear her children's soft breathing, the sound of innocent sleep undisturbed by the earthquake that had just shaken their mother's world. Tomorrow she would call Mr. Ellis back. Tomorrow she would start figuring out what this meant, how to manage it, what to do with wealth she'd never imagined possessing. But tonight she sat in the darkness of her father's house, her house, and let herself feel the weight of his love, his wisdom, and his final gift. Not just money, but the knowledge that she'd already proven herself worthy of it. If patience is wealth, then I am rich already. Finally, she understood what her father had meant. She'd always been rich, in strength, in character, in the refusal to break. The money was just the world finally catching up to what Harold Burke had known all along. His daughter was worth more than gold. The bus ride downtown took 43 minutes and cost $2.50 that Sandra couldn't really afford to spend. She sat near the back, her children dressed in their best clothes, hand-me-downs from the church donation bin that she'd carefully washed and ironed the night before. Marcus pressed his face against the window, fascinated by the tall buildings growing larger as they approached the city center. Lily sat quietly in Sandra's lap, sucking her thumb, sensing her mother's nervous energy. Sandra had never been to this part of the city. The buildings here were glass and steel monuments to wealth, their reflective surfaces catching the morning sun and throwing it back in brilliant, blinding shards. Everything felt foreign, the suited professionals striding purposefully down sidewalks, the coffee shops with names in languages she didn't speak, the cars that cost more than most people earned in a year. This wasn't her world. It never had been. The address Mr. Ellis had given her led to a building whose lobby alone was larger than her entire house. White marble floors stretched endlessly beneath cathedral ceilings. A chandelier that looked like it belonged in a palace hung overhead, casting prismatic light across walls of polished wood and brass. Sandra stood in the entrance, suddenly conscious of her worn coat, her children's scuffed shoes, the way they didn't belong in a place like this. A security guard approached, middle-aged, black like her, his uniform crisp and professional. "Can I help you, ma'am?" I'm here to see James Ellis. Whitmore and Associates?" Her voice sounded small, uncertain. The guard's expression softened. He gestured toward the elevators. 32nd floor. They're expecting you." The elevator ride felt like ascending into another dimension. Each floor brought them higher above the life Sandra knew. The grime, the struggle, the constant fight for survival. When the doors opened on the 32nd floor, she stepped into a reception area that looked like something from a magazine. Leather couches, abstract art, floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking a city she'd only ever seen from bus stops and street corners. "Ms. Burke?" A woman in her 50s stood from behind a sleek reception desk. "Mr. Ellis is ready for you. Can I get you anything? Water? Coffee? Something for the children?" "We're fine," Sandra said automatically, though Lily was tugging at her hand and Marcus's eyes were wide with wonder at the fish tank built into one wall. Mr. Ellis's office was all glass and light, the kind of space that felt designed to intimidate. But the man who rose from behind the massive oak desk didn't look intimidating at all. He was in his late 50s, with kind eyes behind wire-rimmed glasses and salt and pepper hair. His suit probably cost more than Sandra had earned in the last 6 months, but his smile was genuine, warm. "Ms. Burke," he came around the desk with his hand extended. "It's an honor to finally meet you. Your father spoke of you often." Sandra shook his hand, confused. "You knew my father?" "For over 20 years, Mr. Ellis said gently. He was more than a client, Miss Burke. He was a friend. Please sit." Sandra settled into one of the leather chairs facing his desk, her children flanking her. Mr. Ellis returned to his seat and pulled out a thick folder. "I want to show you something," he said, opening the folder to reveal document after document. "This is your father's investment history, compiled over 4 decades. He spread the papers across the desk like a timeline. Sandra leaned forward, seeing her father's handwriting on some of the older documents, meticulous notes in the margins, calculations done by hand. "In 1989, your father invested $500 in a startup called Clean Tech Industries," Mr. Ellis began, pointing to a yellowed certificate. "It was 3 former janitors who wanted to create eco-friendly cleaning products, safer chemicals, better equipment, solutions that wouldn't harm the people using them or the environment. Your father believed in their mission because he lived it every day." Sandra stared at the certificate, her father's name printed in faded ink. Every month after that, he invested what he could, sometimes $50, sometimes $100, never more than he could afford, but never missing a month. He attended the Northside Investment Club, learned about compound interest, dividend reinvestment, long-term holding strategies. Mr. Ellis pulled out more documents, statements from the 90s showing small balances, then larger ones from the early 2000s. The numbers grew incrementally, nothing dramatic, just steady, patient accumulation. Clean tech grew slowly at first. They supplied local businesses, then regional chains, then national accounts. In 2018, they expanded internationally. Their eco-friendly products were perfect for the growing sustainability market. Last year, they went public. He pulled out a recent document, and Sandra's eyes went wide at the numbers. Clean Tech Industries was now valued at over $8 billion, with operations in 43 countries. Your father's shares, which he never sold, always held, always believed in, are now worth approximately $138 million. Combined with his other long-term investments, dividend accumulations, and compound interest over 4 decades. Mr. Ellis met her eyes. "The total value of your inheritance is $150 million. The world stopped. Sandra heard the words, saw the documents, but none of it felt real. The woman who'd scrubbed Margaret Langford's floors for minimum wage, who'd been thrown out like garbage, who'd worked 3 jobs just to feed her children. That woman couldn't be worth more than the family that had cast her out. It was impossible. This, this can't be right, Sandra whispered. Her hands trembled as she reached for the documents. How can someone like me have that kind of money? Someone like you, Mr. Ellis's voice was gentle but firm. Ms. Burke, your father spent 40 years proving that people like you, people who work hard, who persevere, who refuse to quit even when the world treats them as invisible, are exactly the people who deserve this kind of wealth. Sandra shook her head, tears streaming down her face. I clean floors. I scrub toilets. I'm nobody. The Langfords, they made sure I knew that every single day. How can I be wealthier than they are? Mr. Ellis stood and came around the desk, kneeling beside her chair so they were at eye level. Your father left you something else, he said softly. A letter. He asked me to give it to you when you came. He handed her an envelope, thick, cream-colored paper with her name written in her father's familiar script. Sandra's hands shook so badly she could barely open it. Inside were several pages, her father's handwriting filling every line. My dearest Sandra, this isn't a gift. This is proof. Proof that your worth was never in the dirt you cleaned, but in the hands that worked without complaining. Proof that dignity doesn't come from what others think of you, but from knowing who you are. Proof that even those who scrub the floors of the mighty can one day own the ground they walk on. I was a janitor. So were you. The world looked at us and saw people to be stepped over, ignored, dismissed. But we saw everything. We learned everything. And we built something they could never understand. Character, perseverance, and faith that hard work, honest work, has value that goes beyond a paycheck. Every $50 I invested was a declaration. I matter. My work matters. My daughter's future matters. I lived frugally not because I was poor, but because I knew the difference between needing and wanting. I invested not because I was greedy, but because I understood patience. And I kept it secret from you not to be cruel, but because I needed you to discover your own strength first. You did, Sandra. You stood on your own. You raised your children with love and dignity, even when the world tried to break you. You proved that you didn't need rescue. You were your own salvation. This money is simply confirmation of what I always knew. You are worth more than gold. Use it wisely. Use it kindly. Build something that lasts. And never, ever let anyone tell you that the work you do makes you less than they are. I love you, baby girl. I'm so proud of you. Forever your father, Harold Burke. Sandra broke down completely, her shoulders shaking with sobs that came from a place so deep she didn't know it existed. All the years of being overlooked, dismissed, treated as invisible. All the times she'd wondered if Margaret Langford was right, if she really was less than, if her work really did make her worthless. All of it shattered in the face of her father's words. Marcus and Lily wrapped their arms around her, their small bodies pressing close. Mr. Ellis stepped back, giving them space, his own eyes wet. When Sandra finally looked up, her face was streaked with tears, but her voice was steady. There's another envelope, at home. He left it for me to find. Mr. Ellis nodded. Open it when you're ready. Your father left several messages for you, each one time for when he thought you'd need it most. Sandra pulled the second envelope from her purse, the one she'd found in her father's ledger, labeled for Sandra, when the world forgets your worth. Her fingers trembled as she broke the seal. Inside was a single card, her father's handwriting bold and certain across the center. Build something that lasts. 3 words. That was all. But they carried the weight of Harold Burke's entire legacy, not the money. That's not the money, but the mission. Don't just survive. Don't just accumulate wealth. Build something that matters. Build something that lifts others the way he'd lifted her. Sandra pressed the card to her chest, her tears falling onto the expensive carpet of Mr. Ellis's office. Her father hadn't left her money. He'd left her purpose. The woman who'd been kicked out of the Langford estate with nothing but garbage bags and heartbreak was now wealthier than the family that had cast her out. But the real inheritance wasn't the dollars in her account. It was the knowledge that her worth had never been determined by the floors she scrubbed or the people she served. Her worth had always been in the strength of her character, the devotion in her heart, and the refusal to let the world define her. "What happens now?" Sandra asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Mr. Ellis returned to his desk with a small smile. Now you decide what to build, Miss Burke. Your father gave you the foundation. The rest is up to you." Sandra looked at her children, Marcus with his curious eyes, Lily with her gentle spirit, and thought about the house on Ashbury Road that needed so much work. She thought about the Langfords in their crumbling empire. She thought about every janitor, every maid, every worker who'd ever been treated as invisible. Build something that lasts. "I think," Sandra said slowly, her voice growing stronger with each word, "I know exactly what my father wanted me to build." Outside the windows, the city stretched endlessly, its glass towers catching the afternoon sun. Somewhere out there were people like her, people who worked hard and were overlooked, people who deserved dignity and never received it. Sandra Burke had just become one of the wealthiest women in the state, but more importantly, she'd just become the keeper of her father's mission, to prove that even those who clean the floors of the mighty deserve to own the ground they walk on. The foundation was laid. Now it was time to build. Margaret Langford stood in the study of her estate, staring at the stack of legal documents spread across her husband's mahogany desk. Each page represented another crack in the empire they'd spent 40 years building. Foreclosure notices, lawsuit summons, creditor demands, bank warnings. The Langford Real Estate Development Company, once valued at over $300 million, was collapsing like a house built on sand. It had started small, a failed luxury condo development in Miami that had hemorrhaged money when the market shifted. Then came the lawsuits from investors who claimed misrepresentation. Then the revelation that Richard's chief financial officer, their son, Charles, had made a series of catastrophically bad investments, leveraging the company's assets on high-risk ventures that had spectacularly imploded. The banks were circling now, demanding repayment on loans that had once seemed like pocket change. Properties were being quietly listed for sale. The estate itself, this sprawling monument to their wealth and prestige, had a lien against it. Margaret touched the pearl necklace at her throat, a nervous habit she'd developed over the past 6 months. These pearls were real, inherited from her grandmother. Almost everything else was smoke and mirrors now, desperate attempts to maintain appearances while the foundation rotted beneath them. That's when she'd heard the whisper. It came from Helen Worthington at the country club, delivered with the kind of catty delight that high society women specialized in. "Did you hear about your former housekeeper, Sandra Burke? Apparently, she's come into quite as a fortune. Something about her father's investments. They're saying it's over $100 million. Can you imagine?" Margaret had smiled tightly and changed the subject, but the words had haunted her for days. Sandra Burke, the janitor she'd dismissed without a second thought, the widow she'd thrown out of the servants' quarters like garbage. That Sandra Burke was now worth more than the Langford family? It was impossible. Insulting. And yet, if it was true, Margaret picked up her phone, her hands trembling slightly. She'd never thought she'd make this call, never imagined she'd need to, but desperation made people do things they'd once considered beneath them. She dialed the number her assistant had tracked down, Sandra's new cell phone, and waited. Sandra was in the middle of painting what would become her daughter's bedroom when her phone rang. She'd been working on the house on Ashbury Road for the past 3 weeks, using a small portion of her inheritance to hire contractors for the dangerous repairs while she handled the aesthetic work herself. It felt important to restore her father's house with her own hands, to honor his memory through labor. The caller ID showed a number she didn't recognize, but she'd learned to answer calls now. Important people were trying to reach her: lawyers, financial advisors, foundation consultants. "Hello?" "Sandra." The voice was crisp, cultured, and instantly recognizable despite the months since Sandra had last heard it. "This is Margaret Langford. I hope I'm not catching you at a bad time." Sandra's paintbrush froze mid-stroke. She looked down at her paint-splattered clothes, at her children playing with blocks in the corner, at the room she was transforming from decay into beauty. Then she looked at her reflection in the window, the woman she'd become in the months since leaving the Langford estate. "Mrs. Langford," Sandra said evenly, "this is unexpected." "Yes, well," Margaret's voice carried a manufactured warmth that made Sandra's skin crawl. "I've been meaning to reach out for some time. I heard about your change in circumstances, your father's legacy. How wonderful for you." Sandra said nothing, letting the silence stretch. "I was hoping," Margaret continued, her voice carefully casual, "that we might meet, for tea perhaps, at the estate. I feel we left things unfinished, and I'd like the opportunity to reconnect." Reconnect, as if they'd ever been connected in the first place. "I'll have to check my schedule," Sandra said softly. Of course, of course. How about Saturday, 2 o'clock? I'll have Cook prepare your favorites." Cook didn't know Sandra's favorites. Cook had never made meals for the servants, only for the family. But Sandra simply said, "Saturday at 2, I'll be there." After she hung up, Sandra stared at her phone for a long moment. She knew exactly what this was. Margaret Langford didn't do reconciliation. She did manipulation. But Sandra was no longer the frightened widow with nowhere to go. She was no longer someone who could be dismissed or controlled. It was time to face the woman who tried to break her. Sandra drove herself to the estate in a modest but elegant sedan. She'd refused her financial advisor's suggestion to buy something ostentatious. She wore a simple navy dress, pearl earrings, and minimal makeup. Nothing flashy, nothing that screamed new money. Just quiet dignity, the kind that couldn't be purchased. The wrought iron gates looked smaller than as she remembered. The estate's gardens, once immaculately maintained, showed signs of neglect. Overgrown hedges, weeds creeping through flower beds, a fountain that stood silent and dry. Even from the outside, Sandra could see the empire crumbling. A new housekeeper, younger, nervous, answered the door and led Sandra to the east parlor where she'd first been interviewed 6 years ago. Everything looked the same, yet diminished somehow. The furniture still gleamed, but Sandra noticed the faded patches on the upholstery, the crack in one window's corner, the way the chandelier's crystals were clouded with dust. Margaret entered with a theatrical flourish, her arms extended as if greeting an old friend. She'd aged in the months since Sandra had seen her. New lines around her mouth, gray roots showing beneath her carefully styled hair, her designer dress hanging a bit too loosely on her frame. "Sandra, darling." Margaret air-kissed both of Sandra's cheeks, a gesture she'd never offered when Sandra worked here. "You look wonderful, simply wonderful. Please sit." Sandra settled into the ivory settee where she'd once sat as an applicant, desperate for work. Now she sat as something else entirely. "Tea?" Margaret gestured to an elaborate silver service. "No, thank you." Margaret's smile tightened fractionally. She poured herself a cup with hands that shook slightly, the china rattling. "I want to apologize," Margaret began, her voice carrying a rehearsed quality, "for how we parted. It was a difficult time, Thomas's death, the estate's staffing needs, and I fear I was not as gracious as I should have been." Sandra watched her, saying nothing. "The truth is," Margaret continued, setting down her teacup, "I've thought about you often, about your children. How are they? They must be doing well, given your good fortune." "They're fine. Wonderful, wonderful." Margaret's smile was becoming strained. "Sandra, I'll be direct. The Langford family finds itself in a period of transition. Some investments haven't performed as expected, and we're exploring new opportunities. I couldn't help but think that someone with your newfound resources might be interested in partnership opportunities." There it was, the real reason for this meeting. "Partnership opportunities," Sandra repeated softly. "Yes, real estate development, property management, areas where the Langford name carries weight combined with your capital." Margaret leaned forward, her desperation beginning to show through the manufactured charm. "We could help each other, Sandra. Think of what we could build together." Sandra let the words hang in the air for a long moment. She looked around the parlor where she'd once cleaned, where she'd been invisible, where Margaret Langford had made it abundantly clear that Sandra would never be one of them. When Sandra finally spoke, her voice was quiet but carried the weight of every humiliation, every slight, every moment she'd been treated as less than human. "You fired me for being beneath you," she said, meeting Margaret's eyes. "I think that says all we need to know about partnership." Margaret's face went white. "Sandra, when my husband died driving your son to a business meeting, you gave me 1 week to pack up my life and leave. You told me your accommodations were for employees, not widows." Sandra stood, gathering her purse. "You didn't see me as a person then. You saw me as something to be discarded when I was no longer useful. Things were complicated." "No, Mrs. Langford. Things were simple. You had power, and you used it to be cruel." Sandra moved toward the door, then paused. "The difference between us is that now I have power, and I choose to be kind." "Wait." Margaret stood, her composure cracking like ice over a thawing lake. "Please, Sandra, you don't understand. We're losing everything. The banks, the lawsuits. We could lose the estate. Charles is facing criminal charges for fraud. Richard's health is failing from the stress. I'm asking for help." Sandra turned back, and for a moment, she felt something close to pity. Margaret Langford, who'd once ruled this estate like a cold, untouchable queen, now stood trembling in her own parlor, begging the janitor she'd thrown out. "I'm sorry for what you're going through," Sandra said, and she meant it. "But you taught me a valuable lesson, Mrs. Langford. You taught me that when people show you who they are, you should believe them. You showed me who you were. I believed you." Sandra walked through the foyer, the same marble floors she'd once scrubbed on her hands and knees, and out the front door. The November air was crisp and clean, washing away the stale atmosphere of the estate. Behind her, she heard Margaret's voice, cracking with something that might have been tears. "The janitor I threw out is richer than I'll ever be, isn't she?" Sandra paused at the top of the steps, looking back at the woman framed in the doorway. Margaret looked smaller somehow, diminished by the weight of her own choices. "Yes," Sandra said simply, "but that's not what matters." "Then what does?" Sandra thought of her father's letter, of his words about dignity and worth, of his lifetime of patient work that had built something lasting. "What matters is that my worth was never determined by how you treated me. It was always there in every floor I scrubbed, every honest day's work. You just couldn't see it." Sandra descended the steps, her head high. "That's your tragedy, Mrs. Langford. Not losing your money, losing your ability to see the value in people who weren't like you." Sandra walked away from the Langford estate for the second time in her life. But this time, she wasn't fleeing with garbage bags and broken dreams. This time, she left with her dignity intact, her children secure, and her future limitless. In her rearview mirror, she saw Margaret still standing in the doorway of the crumbling estate, watching the woman she'd once dismissed drive away in quiet triumph. The empire was falling. The janitor had risen. And Sandra Burke had proven that true wealth wasn't measured in real estate holdings or family legacies. It was measured in character, compassion, and the courage to stand tall even when the world tried to make you small. Margaret Langford would learn that lesson too late. But Sandra Burke had known it all along. 2 months after her meeting with Margaret Langford, Sandra sat in a conference room 40 floors above the city with her financial advisors, her attorney, Mr. Ellis, and 3 members of her newly formed investment team. On the table before them was a thick folder marked Langford Estate Foreclosure Sale. "The bank is motivated to sell quickly," her real estate advisor explained, sliding photographs of the property across the table. "They've been sitting on this for 3 months since the Langfords defaulted on their loan. The family has been given multiple extensions, but the debt is substantial, $28 million, plus accumulated interest and penalties." Sandra studied the photographs. The estate where she'd once scrubbed floors, where Thomas had died driving the family's car, where Margaret Langford had looked down on her with ice in her eyes. It looked smaller in pictures than in her memories, less imposing. "The estate itself is valued at approximately $42 million, the advisor continued. "Given the circumstances and the bank's eagerness, we could likely acquire it for $35 million. It's an excellent investment property, 12 acres, the main house, 3 auxiliary buildings, The carriage house where you, he paused, realizing what he was about to say. Where I used to live with my husband and children, Sandra finished quietly. I know. Mr. Ellis leaned forward. Sandra, you don't have to do this. There are thousands of properties we could invest in. This one carries emotional weight. Sandra looked at the photograph of the grand entrance, remembering the last time she'd walked through those doors, her head high, her dignity intact, walking away from Margaret's desperate plea for partnership. She thought that would be closure, the final chapter of that painful story, but something in her father's words kept echoing. Build something that lasts. I want to buy it, Sandra said, but I want to do it through a holding company. The Langfords don't need to know who's purchasing until the sale is final. Her attorney nodded. We can structure it through Burke Holdings, LLC. The transaction will be entirely confidential until the deed transfer. Do it. 3 weeks later, on a gray Thursday morning, the foreclosure sale was finalized. Sandra stood in her newly restored house on Ashbury Road, her father's house, now transformed from decay into a warm, welcoming home. When Mr. Ellis called, "It's done," he said simply. "You are now the owner of the Langford estate. The deed transfer was filed this morning. The Langford's attorney was notified an hour ago." Sandra thanked him and hung up. She looked around the living room where her children were playing, where sunlight streamed through new windows onto refinished floors. This house, modest but filled with love and her father's memory, felt more like home than any mansion ever could. But the Langford estate now belonged to her too. The question was, what would she do with it? The call from Margaret came that evening. Sandra answered on the third ring. You. Margaret's voice was barely above a whisper. It was you, Burke Holdings, Sandra Burke. Hello, Mrs. Langford. I received the deed transfer this afternoon. Margaret's breath came in short, sharp gasps. I kept staring at the signature, thinking there had to be a mistake. But there wasn't, was there? You bought our home. You bought our family's estate. Sandra walked to her window, looking out at the modest street where her father had once lived, where she'd rebuilt her life from nothing. The bank was foreclosing. I made an investment purchase. An investment? Margaret laughed bitterly. Is this revenge then? You waited until we were at our lowest, and now you're going to throw us out the way I threw you out? No, Mrs. Langford, that's not who I am. Then what do you want? Sandra was quiet for a long moment. I'd like to visit, tomorrow if that's convenient. I'll bring my children. I think it's time they saw where their father worked, where their mother once made a life before everything changed. Margaret's silence was heavy with defeat. Of course, it's your property now. You don't need my permission. I'm not asking for permission, Sandra said softly. I'm asking for time. I'll see you tomorrow at 2. Sandra drove through the wrought iron gates of the Langford estate with Marcus and Lily in the back seat. The children were older now, braver, their eyes wide with wonder at the grand house their mother had once described in stories. Mama, you used to live here? Lily asked, pressing her face against the window. In the small house out back, Sandra said, with your daddy. She parked in the circular drive and helped her children out. The front door opened before they reached it, and Margaret stood in the entrance. She'd aged dramatically in the months since Sandra had last seen her. Her hair was more gray than blonde now, her face lined with stress and sleepless nights. She wore a simple dress, no pearls, no jewelry. Even her legendary composure seemed to have crumbled away, leaving only exhaustion. Sandra, Margaret said, her voice hollow. Children, please come in. They entered the grand foyer, and Sandra felt the weight of memory pressing down on her. Here was where she'd carried buckets of cleaning supplies, where she'd polished marble on her hands and knees, where she'd once felt invisible. Now her footsteps echoed differently, the steps of an owner, not a servant. But she took no pleasure in it. Mama, it's so big. Marcus ran ahead, his sneakers squeaking on the polished floor, his laughter bouncing off the high ceilings. Lily followed, more careful, reaching up to touch the chandelier that hung just barely within her reach. Sandra walked slowly through the rooms, her hand trailing along walls she'd once scrubbed. She could still see the ghost of her younger self reflected in the gleaming surfaces. That desperate woman who'd worked so hard, who'd loved a good man, who'd thought service meant belonging. She'd been so wrong. Service had never meant belonging. Dignity had. Margaret followed at a distance, her arms wrapped around herself as if trying to hold something together that was irreparably broken. When they reached the library, she finally spoke. "Are you going to throw us out?" Sandra turned to face her. The children were in the next room, their voices distant and happy. In this space, it was just two women who'd once occupied very different positions in the same house, now looking at each other across a chasm that money couldn't bridge. "No," Sandra said quietly. "I know what that feels like. I'll give you time." Margaret's composure shattered. Tears streamed down her face, her shoulders shaking. "Wait, huh? After everything I did to you, everything I said, why would you show me mercy I never showed you?" Sandra thought of her father's letter, of his words about dignity and worth, of the difference between having power and knowing how to use it. "Because someone taught me that true wealth isn't measured by what you own, but by who you are when you have the power to hurt someone who hurt you." Sandra stepped closer, her voice gentle but firm. "You taught me how it feels to be powerless. My father taught me how to build power the right way, not through cruelty, but through character. I don't deserve your kindness. Maybe not, but I deserve to be the kind of person who offers it anyway." Sandra looked around the grand library, at the leather-bound books that no one had probably read in decades, at the portraits of Langford ancestors looking down with stern disapproval. "You can stay in the estate for 6 months while you find somewhere else to live. After that, I'm converting it." "Converting it to what?" "The Burke Foundation headquarters, a training center for workers who want to build careers in hospitality management, property maintenance, and service industries. The same industries that people like my father and I worked in our whole lives. Only this time, the workers will be treated with dignity, paid fairly, and given opportunities to grow." Margaret stared at her, something like wonder breaking through the grief in her eyes. "You're going to turn our family estate into a training center for janitors?" "For people," Sandra corrected. "For human beings who deserve respect and opportunity regardless of what work they do." Marcus came running back into the room, tugging at Sandra's hand. "Mama, can we see where Daddy used to work?" Sandra smiled and took her children outside, across the pristine lawn to the carriage house where she and Thomas had once lived. It was smaller than she remembered, the windows dusty, the door hanging slightly crooked on its hinges. But it was still standing, still holding the memories of the life they'd built. "Your daddy parked cars right here," Sandra told Marcus, pointing to the garage. "And your mama cleaned the big house every day. We didn't have much, but we had each other. And we had dignity, even when people tried to take it from us." "Were you sad, Mama?" Lily asked, her small hand finding Sandra's. "Sometimes," Sandra admitted, "but your grandfather taught me something important. That our worth isn't determined by how others treat us. It's determined by how we treat ourselves and others, especially when it would be easier to be cruel." She looked back at the main house, where Margaret stood in the window watching them. The woman who'd once ruled this estate like a cold queen now stood alone in a house that no longer belonged to her. Watching the janitor she'd dismissed reclaim not just the property but the narrative itself, Sandra didn't gloat. She didn't wave or smile triumphantly. She simply stood with her children in the place where her old life had ended, knowing that her new life, built on her father's wisdom and her own hard-won strength, was just beginning. Justice didn't always look like revenge. Sometimes it looked like a black woman standing on a land that once belonged to people who treated her as invisible, her children laughing beside her, her head held high. Sometimes justice looked like mercy given to people who'd never offered it, not because they deserved it, but because it proved that wealth of character would always triumph over wealth of circumstance. Sandra Burke had once scrubbed the floors of this estate. Now she owned them. But more importantly, she'd proven that even those who clean the floors of the mighty can one day own the ground they walk on and use that ownership to lift others up rather than tear them down. That was her father's legacy. That was her inheritance. And that was what she would build. Something that lasted far beyond property deeds and bank accounts. A foundation of dignity for everyone who'd ever been treated as less than they were worth. As Sandra led her children back to the car, Margaret called out from the doorway, "Sandra?" Sandra turned. "Thank you," Margaret whispered, the words carried on the wind, "for showing me what grace looks like." Sandra simply nodded and drove away, leaving the Langford estate behind, not in bitterness or triumph, but in peace. She'd reclaimed her story. She'd honored her father's memory, and she'd proven that the most powerful thing anyone can do with wealth is use it to prove that everyone deserves dignity. The estate would become something new, something better, something that lasted. And Sandra Burke, once a janitor, now a builder of legacies, would make sure of it. 6 months after purchasing the Langford estate, Sandra stood in what had once been Margaret Langford's grand ballroom, overseeing the final preparations for the inaugural gala of the Burke Foundation for Working Families. Crystal chandeliers sparkled overhead, the same ones she'd once cleaned, but now they illuminated a transformed space filled with hope rather than hierarchy. The transformation had been swift but deliberate. Sandra had poured $50 million of her inheritance into establishing the foundation, creating comprehensive programs that addressed the needs she'd lived through herself. Scholarships for children of low-income workers, housing assistance for families in crisis, job training programs for people seeking careers in hospitality and service industries, and emergency funds for workers facing unexpected hardship. But the foundation's most radical element was its staff. Sandra had personally recruited every member of her team from the ranks of people who understood struggle intimately. Maria Gonzalez, the foundation's program director, had spent 20 years as a hotel housekeeper before Sandra found her. James Washington, who ran the scholarship program, had been a parking garage attendant who'd put himself through community college one class at a time. Linda Chen, the housing assistance coordinator, had once cleaned office buildings at night while raising 3 children alone. These weren't charity cases. They were experts in survival, resilience, and dignity. They knew what working families needed because they'd been working families themselves. Ms. Burke? Maria appeared at Sandra's elbow, clipboard in hand. The guests are starting to arrive. The reporters are already asking about the anonymous donor. They know someone wealthy is funding all of this, but they don't know who. Sandra smoothed down the emerald gown she wore, elegant but not ostentatious, a color her mother had once told her made her eyes shine. Tonight would be the first time she publicly stepped forward as the foundation's founder and primary donor. For 6 months, she'd operated in the shadows, letting the work speak for itself. But her father's words echoed in her mind. Build something that lasts. To last, the foundation needed a face, a story, a reason for people to believe. And Sandra's story, from janitor to philanthropist, was one that needed telling. Let them wonder a bit longer, Sandra said with a slight smile. We'll reveal everything during my speech. She moved to the entrance, watching as guests filed in. There were politicians who'd pledged support for the foundation's initiatives, business leaders who'd committed to hiring from their job training programs, community organizers who'd partnered on housing projects. But there were also people like Sandra had been, janitors in their Sunday best, housekeepers wearing borrowed jewelry, drivers who'd saved for months to afford new suits. The foundation's invitation list had been deliberately diverse. In this room, the person who cleaned corporate offices sat beside the person who owned them. And for tonight, at least, they were equals. As Sandra greeted guests, she noticed a figure standing alone near the back of the ballroom, partially obscured by a marble column. Margaret Langford. Sandra hadn't invited her, but she'd left Margaret's name on the estate's permanent guest list. The older woman wore a simple black dress, no pearls, no diamonds, just understated elegance born of old breeding and new humility. Her eyes met Sandra's across the crowded room, and something passed between them, not quite forgiveness, not quite friendship, but acknowledgement. Margaret had moved out of the estate 3 months ago, relocating to a modest condo downtown with Richard. Their son Charles was serving time for securities fraud. Their fortune was gone. But Margaret had shown up tonight anyway, to witness what the estate she'd lost had become. The lights dimmed, and Sandra's program director took the stage. Good evening, everyone. Thank you for joining us for the inaugural gala of the Burke Foundation for Working Families. Maria's voice rang clear and confident. For the past 6 months, this foundation had been changing lives, providing over $2 million in scholarships, helping 43 families avoid homelessness, training 112 workers for new careers, and creating a support network for thousands of people who've been overlooked and undervalued by society. Applause rippled through the ballroom. But tonight is special because we're finally revealing the person who made all of this possible. The founder and primary donor of the Burke Foundation has chosen to remain anonymous until now, letting the work speak for itself. But her story, and it is a her story, is one that embodies everything this foundation represents. Maria turned toward where Sandra stood in the wings. Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome Sandra Burke. Sandra stepped onto the stage, her heart pounding, but her head high. The spotlight found her, and she heard the murmur ripple through the crowd. Confusion from those who didn't know her, recognition from those who did, and shock from those who'd known her as the help. She reached the microphone and looked out at the sea of faces. Some were crying already, understanding beginning to dawn. Others leaned forward, curious about this woman in the emerald gown, who somehow commanded the room despite looking nothing like the typical billionaire philanthropist. My name is Sandra Burke, she began, her voice steady. And 6 years ago, I was a janitor working at the Langford estate. I scrubbed the floors you're standing on right now. I polished the chandeliers above your heads. I was invisible to most of the people who walk these halls. The room had gone completely silent. My husband Thomas was a chauffeur. He drove for the family who owned this estate. He died in a car accident while working, leaving me with two small children and nowhere to go. I was fired from my position and evicted from my home. I was told very clearly that I was no longer useful, no longer welcome, no longer worthy of consideration. Sandra paused, letting her words settle over the audience. She could see tears on many faces now, could feel the weight of recognition from others who'd been treated the same way. I moved into my late father's abandoned house with $47 to my name. I worked 3 jobs, cleaning offices at night, scrubbing floors at a laundromat during the day, babysitting on weekends. My hands bled, my body ached, but I survived because I learned something from my father, Harold Burke. She gestured to a large photograph of her father that had been displayed on the stage, Harold in his janitor's uniform. His face weathered but kind, his eyes bright with intelligence and dignity. My father was a janitor too. For 40 years, he worked in service industries, cleaning office buildings and living frugally. But he was also something else. He was a patient, strategic investor who believed that even people like us, people who scrubbed floors and emptied trash cans, deserved to build wealth and legacy. Sandra pulled out the letter her father had left her, holding it up for the audience to see. When I was at my lowest point, I discovered that my father had left me something extraordinary. Not just money, though the investments he had patiently built over decades had grown to $150 million. He left me proof. Her voice broke slightly, but she pressed on. Proof that my worth was never in the dirt I cleaned, but in the hands that worked. Proof that dignity comes from character, not from what others think of you. Proof that even those who scrub the floors of the mighty can one day own the ground they walk on. The applause started then, tentative at first, then building like a wave. Sandra waited for it to quiet before continuing. The Burke Foundation exists because my father taught me something crucial. Having power means nothing if you don't use it to lift others up. I could have used my inheritance for mansions and luxury cars. I could have used it for revenge against those who hurt me. But my father left me one final instruction. She held up the card she'd found in his envelope. Build something that lasts. Sandra looked out at the audience, at Maria and James and Linda on the side of the stage, crying openly, at the janitors and housekeepers sitting proudly in the front rows, at the politicians and business leaders leaning forward with new understanding, and finally at Margaret Langford in the back, tears streaming down her face. This foundation isn't charity, Sandra said firmly. It's justice. It's recognition that the people who clean our buildings, who care for our children, who keep our society functioning deserve dignity, opportunity, and respect. Every scholarship we award, every family we help, every worker we train, they're not charity cases. They're human beings whose worth has always been there, waiting for someone to see it. She paused, looking down at her father's letter one more time before speaking his final words. My father wrote to me, "True wealth is not measured by what you own, but by what you can build for others." That's what we're building here, not just programs and initiatives, but a movement to recognize the inherent dignity of every person who works hard, regardless of what that work looks like. The standing ovation was immediate and thunderous. People rose to their feet, applause mixing with tears, strangers embracing. The room transformed by the power of a story that proved dignity could triumph over circumstance. Sandra stood at the microphone, overwhelmed by the response, by the weight of what she'd built, by the knowledge that her father's legacy and her own would ripple forward in ways she couldn't yet imagine. In the back of the room, Margaret Langford wept openly, no longer trying to maintain the composure that had defined her for decades. For the first time in her life, she felt small, not because of lost wealth or social standing, but because she was witnessing what true greatness looked like. It looked like a black woman in an emerald gown who turned suffering into service, who transformed a mansion of cruelty into a headquarters of hope, who'd proven that the janitor she'd dismissed was worth more than Margaret had ever understood. As the applause continued, Sandra looked up at her father's photograph and whispered, "We built it, Daddy, something that lasts." And in that transformed ballroom, where power had once been used to diminish, Sandra Burke, once invisible, now undeniable, stood as living proof that true wealth isn't inherited. It's built through character, patience, and the unwavering belief that every person who works deserves dignity. The foundation was launched. The story was told. The ground beneath the mighty belonged to those who'd always held it up, and Sandra Burke's legacy had only just begun. Spring came to Ashbury Road like a promise kept. Sandra stood on the front porch of her father's house, her house, watching the late afternoon sun paint the restored Victorian facade and in shades of gold and amber. The transformation was complete. Where peeling paint and rotted wood had once told a story of neglect, now fresh cream-colored siding gleamed beneath a new slate roof. The ornate gingerbread trim, painstakingly restored by craftsmen who specialized in period details, crowned the porch like lacework. New windows, period-accurate sash windows that slid smoothly up and down, reflected the budding trees lining the street. But the real transformation was inside. The house that had once groaned with decay now hummed with purpose. Sandra had converted the ground floor into administrative offices for the Burke Foundation's outreach programs. Her father's old living room was now a welcoming space where workers came for assistance applications, their feet treading on restored hardwood floors that Harold Burke had walked decades ago. The kitchen had become a small conference room where staff meetings happened around the same table where Sandra had once discovered her father's letters. Upstairs remained private, Sandra's bedroom, and rooms for Marcus and Lily that the children had helped design themselves. The attic had been converted into a small library filled with books on business, finance, and social justice, a legacy space where young people from the Foundation's programs could come to study and dream. The house had become exactly what her father had hoped, a foundation strong enough to stand on. "Mama!" Lily's voice called from the backyard, where the children played on a newly installed swing set. "Come see how high I can go." Sandra smiled, but her attention was drawn to the letter in her hand, thick cream-colored stationery that had arrived that morning, addressed in careful, elegant script. She'd recognized the handwriting immediately. Margaret Langford. She settled into the porch swing, another new addition, and opened the envelope with fingers that no longer trembled when confronted with her past. "Dear Sandra, I've written this letter 17 times, and each time the words feel inadequate to carry the weight of what I need to say. But your father taught you that patience builds wealth, and perhaps patience can also build the courage to finally speak truth. I'm sorry, those words don't erase what I did to you, what I said, how I treated you as if your humanity was contingent on your usefulness to me. They don't undo the cruelty of evicting you and your children weeks after your husband died serving my family. They don't reverse the years of dismissal, of making you feel invisible, of treating your dignity as negotiable. But they're the truth, spoken without excuse or justification. I spent most of my life believing that wealth and breeding made me superior to people like you and your father. I measured worth in property deeds and family trees, in country club memberships and society connections. When you worked in my home, I saw your labor but never saw you, the woman, the mother, the daughter carrying forward her father's wisdom and strength. The night of the foundation gala, I stood in the back of my former ballroom and watched you transform shame into purpose, pain into power, cruelty into compassion. I saw what I'd been too blind to see before. You were always the wealthy one. You possess riches I never understood: character, resilience, grace under pressure, the ability to be kind even when kindness wasn't deserved. I've lost almost everything that once defined me: the estate, the fortune, the social standing, all of it gone. What remains is clarity. In losing everything, I finally learned to see you didn't have to show me mercy. You didn't have to give me time to relocate, to preserve some dignity in my defeat. But you did, because that's who you are. You're the woman your father raised you to be, someone who understands that true wealth is measured not by what you own, but by who you are when you have the power to hurt those who hurt you. I'm writing to ask if Richard and I might visit the foundation, not as donors or benefactors, but as students. I want to see what good can grow from the soil of my cruelty. I want to understand what you've built and perhaps learn, even at this late hour, what it means to use whatever remains of my life to build something that matters. If you choose not to respond, I will understand. You owe me nothing. But if you're willing to show an old woman what redemption might look like, I would be grateful beyond measure. With profound respect and genuine remorse, Margaret Langford. Sandra read the letter twice, then folded it carefully and looked out at her children playing in the yard where her father had once tended a small garden. Marcus was pushing Lily on the swing, both of them laughing, their voices carrying on the spring breeze like music. She thought about her father's words: build something that lasts. Forgiveness, she realized, was part of that foundation. Not forgiveness that excused or forgot, but forgiveness that proved cruelty couldn't define the forgiver or diminish the forgiven. Margaret Langford's cruelty had been real, but it didn't own Sandra's future. Only Sandra owned that. She pulled out her phone and typed a simple message. Mrs. Langford, Sturhamarian, you and Richard are welcome to visit the foundation this Saturday at 2 p.m. I'll give you a tour personally. Bring comfortable shoes. There's a lot to see. Sandra. Saturday arrived with perfect weather. Sunny, but not too warm. The kind of day that made the world feel full of possibility. Sandra stood in the foyer of the house on Ashbury Road, now bearing a tasteful brass plaque beside the door. Burke Foundation for Working Families. Administrative Headquarters. When Margaret and Richard arrived in, Sandra barely recognized them. Gone were the designer clothes and aristocratic bearing. Margaret wore simple slacks and a modest blouse, her hair styled practically rather than elaborately. Richard looked smaller somehow, diminished by illness and stress, but his handshake was firm when he greeted Sandra. Thank you for seeing us, Margaret said quietly. Your home is beautiful. The restoration it's remarkable. It was always beautiful, Sandra replied gently. It just needed someone to see its worth beneath the decay. She led them through the house, showing them the offices where foundation staff worked, the conference room where they planned programs, the library upstairs where young people from working families came to study. Margaret paused at the photographs lining the hallway: Harold Burke in his janitor's uniform, Thomas in his chauffeur's cap, Sandra herself scrubbing floors at the Langford estate. You kept them visible, Margaret observed, her voice catching. Of course. This is where we came from. The foundation isn't about forgetting. It's about honoring the dignity that was always there, even when others couldn't see it. They walked to the Langford estate next, where Sandra showed them the transformation of the grand mansion into a comprehensive training center. The ballroom was now a multi-purpose space for classes and workshops. The library held resources for job seekers. The servants' quarters, where Sandra and Thomas had once lived, had been converted into temporary housing for families in crisis. You gave the workers the best rooms, Richard observed, standing in what had once been the master suite, now a bright, welcoming apartment for a single mother and her 3 children. Yes, Sandra said simply, they deserve the best. As they walked the grounds, Margaret stopped at the carriage house where Sandra's family had been evicted. Someone had planted a garden there, vegetables and flowers growing side by side, tended by residents of the foundation's housing program. I stood in this doorway and told you to leave, Margaret whispered, tears streaming down her face. I looked at your grief and saw only inconvenience. I looked at your children and saw only complications. I was a monster. You were human, Sandra corrected. Flawed like all of us. But being human means we have the capacity to change, to learn, to become better than we were. Margaret turned to her, this woman who'd once towered over everyone with cold authority, now small and broken and finally, achingly human. How do you do it? Margaret asked. How do you forgive when forgiveness seems impossible? Sandra thought of her father's letter, of Thomas's last words, of the moment she'd discovered she was worth more than those who'd dismissed her. She thought of her children playing in the yard of the house that had once represented her lowest point. I forgive because holding on to anger would give you power over my future, Sandra said. You already took enough from me. I won't let you take my peace too. As dusk fell, Sandra stood once more on the porch of her restored home. The Langfords had left hours ago, Richard struggling with obvious emotion, Margaret transformed by the weight of what she'd witnessed. Before departing, Margaret had asked quietly if there might be volunteer opportunities at the foundation. Nothing public, nothing that required recognition, just a chance to contribute something meaningful with whatever life remained. Sandra had said yes. Now Marcus and Lily joined her on the porch, tired from playing, but happy. The house glowed with warm light behind them, and through the windows, Sandra could see the foundation staff finishing their work for the day, their laughter and conversation drifting out into the spring evening. She pulled her children close, one tucked under each arm, and whispered the words that had been building in her heart all day. This house was once our ending, she said softly. When we came here, I thought we'd lost everything, Daddy, our home, our future. I thought this broken house was where our story stopped. But it wasn't, Marcus said, wise beyond his 7 years. No, baby, it wasn't. Sandra kissed the top of his head. This house was our beginning. Grandpa Harold knew that. He built something strong enough for us to stand on, and from here we built something even bigger. A foundation that will help other families who feel like their story is ending. 2. Are we rich now, Mama? Lily asked. Sandra smiled, looking at the restored Victorian house glowing with life and purpose. At the children who'd inherited not just money but values. At the foundation bearing her father's name and carrying forward his mission. Yes, baby, we've always been rich. We just didn't measure it in the right way, be permitting. The evening deepened around them, stars beginning to appear in the darkening sky. Somewhere across town, the Langford estate, now the Burke Foundation Training Center, was also glowing with light and purpose. Somewhere, families were being helped, workers were being trained, dignity was being restored to people society had overlooked. And here, on Ashbury Road, in a house that had once groaned under the weight of abandonment and decay, 3 generations of Burke legacy lived on. Harold's wisdom, Thomas's love, Sandra's strength, and her children's bright future. The ground beneath their feet was solid now, built not just with her father's investments, but with faith, resilience, and the unshakable truth that cruelty can be transformed into compassion, that endings can become beginnings, and that even those who scrub the floors of the mighty can one day own and heal the ground they walk on. Sandra Burke had been thrown out of a billionaire's mansion with nothing but grief and $47. Now she stood on her own porch, wealthier than those who dismissed her, not because of the money in her accounts, but because of the legacy she was building. A legacy of dignity, justice, and grace that would outlast any fortune. The house on Ashbury Road had once represented her father's dreams deferred. Now it represented dreams fulfilled, multiplied, and passed forward to children who would grow up knowing their worth had never been in question. As night fell completely, Sandra whispered one final prayer of gratitude to the father who'd built a foundation strong enough to hold not just his daughter, but thousands of others who needed to know they mattered. The house glowed behind them, proof that faith and resilience can outlast any cruelty, that broken things can be restored, and that the truest wealth is measured not in what we own, but in what we build for others. The ending had become a beginning, the foundation held strong, and Sandra Burke, once invisible, now undeniable, stood on the ground she owned, not with pride but with purpose, ready to lift others the way her father had lifted her. Build something that lasts, she had, and it would endure long after she was gone, a testament to the truth that even those who clean the floors of the mighty deserve to own and transform the ground they walk on. If this story moved you, share the moment. Don't let it fade. Follow Motherland Stories and tap that like button to keep these voices alive. Every day we uncover strong stories, raw truths, and quiet acts of courage that shape our world. Join a circle of listeners, dreamers, and changemakers, because every story deserves to be heard. This wasn't just an episode, it was a call to remember. Silence hides injustice. Courage exposes it. At Motherland Stories, we don't turn away. We bear witness. Subscribe and stand with stories that challenge power and celebrate truth.